How the FBI and CIA discover that Iman's husband, Mustafa, is one of the 19 hijackers who participated in the cowardly terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, against America. In the novel, the process by which the FBI and CIA discover that Iman's husband, Mustafa, is one of the 19 hijackers who participated in the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks is described as a multi-step international investigation triggered by suspicions about Iman's identity and background after she immigrates to Canada. Here's how the discovery unfolds according to the novel. 1. Initial suspicion and investigation in Canada. After Iman, formerly Irshad/Susan, settles in Canada and quickly rises in her job at the Toronto Immigration Office, her rapid success and language skills draw attention and jealousy from a colleague named Hala. Hala, feeling threatened, tries to undermine Iman by filing a complaint and then involving her boyfriend, a senior officer in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, to investigate Iman's background. The RCMP, unable to verify Iman's claim of being an American citizen, refers her case to the FBI in the United States for verification. 2. FBI investigation. The FBI investigates the information Iman provided about her supposed American family, address, college, and church, but finds no matching records in the United States. There is no record of an American woman married to a Saudi man named Mustafa Atta, her late husband, and subsequently traveling with him to his country. The FBI prepares a report and sends it to the RCMP in Toronto, confirming that Iman's claim to be American is false. 3. Confrontation and admission. Confronted with this evidence, Iman is forced to admit that she lied about her American identity. She then reveals her true background. She was born and raised in Sydney, Australia, and provides accurate information about her family and address. The RCMP keeps her in custody while they verify her new claim. 4. Verification by Australian authorities. The RCMP contacts the Sydney Police in Australia, who confirm her story through her family, the imam who conducted her marriage, and her college records. This process verifies her true identity as Susan Peterson, an Australian who converted to Islam, married a Saudi man, and later immigrated to Canada under a false identity. 5. CIA involvement and final discovery. After confirming her identity, the Canadian police refer her case to the CIA, as her late husband was involved in terrorist activities. The CIA becomes interested in her due to her association with terrorist groups. According to a secret report from the Saudi police, Mustafa al-Shamari is identified as one of the 19 Arab Muslim terrorists who carried out the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. The report reveals that Mustafa traveled to the United States under a forged identity and participated in the hijacking of 4 domestic American airliners, directing them at targets in New York and elsewhere, killing 3,000 innocent Americans in one day. 6. International confirmation. The CIA obtains information from the Saudi Criminal Investigation Department and other sources, confirming Mustafa's involvement in the attacks and his connection to Iman, Irshad/Susan. This leads to Iman being handed over to U.S. authorities and sent to Guantanamo Bay as a suspected terrorist due to her association with her late husband and her years spent in Afghanistan among the Mujahideen. Summary table. Steps in the discovery. Step. Agency/action. Outcome. 1. RCMP investigates Iman's background. Refers case to FBI. 2. FBI checks U.S. records. Finds no match, reports back. 3. Iman admits real identity. RCMP verifies with Sydney Police. 4. Sydney Police confirm identity. RCMP refers case to CIA. 5. CIA investigates Mustafa. Confirms he is a 9/11 hijacker. 6. International agencies share info. Iman is detained as a terror suspect. In essence, the FBI and CIA discover Mustafa's role as a 9/11 hijacker through a combination of international law enforcement collaboration, background checks, and intelligence sharing. all triggered by inconsistencies in Iman's immigration story and the subsequent unraveling of her true identity and connections. The discovery of Irshad, Susan Peterson, the wife of the notorious terrorist Mustafa, living in Toronto as described in the novel For the Sake of My Children, triggers a dramatic and multi-layered reaction in Canada, Australia, and America. Here's a detailed summary based strictly on the novel's content. Canadian reaction. Shock and outrage when it is revealed that Irshad, the wife of one of the 9/11 terrorists, has been living in Toronto. The Canadian public is shocked and outraged. The news becomes sensational, and there is widespread astonishment that such a high-profile figure could have entered and lived in Canada undetected for so long. Media frenzy. The media covers the story extensively, connecting the dots between her late husband's involvement in the 9/11 attacks, and her own journey through various countries. Journalists and broadcasters interview her, and her story becomes front-page news and a topic of national debate. Government and law enforcement. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, and Canadian immigration authorities face criticism for failing to detect her true identity and background. There is a sense of embarrassment and a need for damage control within the government. Muslim community response. The local Muslim community is deeply concerned about the fate of Irshad's children, organizing protests and demanding that the children be placed with Muslim families rather than non-Muslim foster care. There are demonstrations and legal actions to influence the custody decisions. Public debate. The case sparks heated debates about immigration, security, religious freedom, and the integration of refugees. There is also controversy over whether Irshad should be treated as a victim, a criminal, or both. Australian reaction. National shock. Australians are stunned to learn that one of their own citizens, Susan Peterson, became the wife of a 9/11 terrorist and lived such a dramatic, hidden life. The public is both horrified and fascinated by her story. Media coverage. Australian media outlets cover the story extensively, focusing on her background, her family's reaction, and the broader implications for national security and multiculturalism. Family and community. Her family, who had lost contact with her for years, is contacted by authorities and the media. There is a mix of relief, sorrow, and confusion as they process the news. Government response. The Australian government is pressured to explain how a citizen could become involved with international terrorism and what steps are being taken to prevent similar cases. American reaction. Security and justice focus. In the United States, the discovery is seen through the lens of national security and justice for the victims of 9/11. The CIA and FBI become involved, and Irshad is eventually detained and sent to Guantanamo Bay for investigation. Public and media. The American public is both suspicious and curious about Irshad. There is debate about whether she was a victim, a collaborator, or simply caught in tragic circumstances. The media covers her story as part of the broader narrative of the War on Terror. Political fallout. The case is used by some as an example of the need for stricter immigration and security measures, while others see it as a cautionary tale about the complexities of global conflict and the human cost of terrorism. Summary table. Country. Public reaction. Media. Government. Community. Canada. Shock, outrage, debate over security and custody of children. Sensational coverage, interviews, debate. Criticism of RCMP and immigration, legal action. Muslim community protests, legal battles over children's custody. Australia. Stunned, national soul-searching. Extensive coverage, focus on family. Questions about radicalization, security. Family contacted, emotional impact. America. Security focus, suspicion, curiosity. Major news, part of 9/11 narrative. CIA/FBI involvement, detention. Political debate on immigration, terrorism, and multiculturalism. In all three countries, the discovery of Irshad/Susan Peterson as the wife of a notorious terrorist is met with a mix of shock, fear, controversy, and intense public scrutiny. The reactions reflect each country's unique concerns: security and justice in America, national identity and radicalization in Australia, and multiculturalism, security, and community tensions in Canada. In the novel, the FBI does not allow Irshad's feet to touch American soil and instead ships her directly to Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, for several interrelated reasons, as described in the text. Association with terrorism. Irshad, formerly Susan Peterson/Iman Atta, is the widow of Mustafa al-Shamari, who is revealed to be one of the 19 terrorists involved in the September 11, 2001, attacks in the United States. Her late husband's direct involvement in 9/11 makes her a person of extreme interest to U.S. authorities. The wife of one of the 9/11 terrorists has been living in Toronto. The Canadian public is shocked and outraged. The news becomes sensational, and there is widespread suspicion of complicity. The CIA and FBI suspect that Irshad may have had knowledge of her husband's terrorist activities and the broader operations of al-Qaeda and the Taliban, since she lived for years in their camps in Afghanistan. There is a concern that she might have been complicit or at least aware of terrorist plots against the U.S. Immigration fraud. Irshad entered Canada under a false identity, claiming to be an American citizen named Iman Atta. When her true identity is uncovered through investigations by the RCMP, FBI, and Australian police, it is revealed that she lied about her background and immigration status. This further raises suspicions about her intentions and credibility. National security protocols. Because of her direct connection to a 9/11 hijacker and her years spent among terrorist groups, U.S. authorities treat her as a high-risk detainee. To prevent any legal complications or the possibility of her claiming rights on U.S. soil, such as the right to request asylum or due process in a civilian court, she is not allowed to physically enter the United States. Instead, she is transferred directly from Canada to a U.S. military plane and then to Guantanamo Bay, which is outside the legal jurisdiction of the U.S. mainland. Guantanamo Bay as a detention center, Gitmo is specifically used to detain individuals suspected of terrorism or connections to terrorist organizations, especially those considered too dangerous or too legally complicated to be held on U.S. soil. By sending Irshad to Gitmo, the authorities can interrogate her, investigate her background, and detain her indefinitely without the legal protections she would have if she set foot in the U.S. proper. Summary. The CIA in New York demanded that the accused, Irshad al-Shamari, be handed over to them for further interrogation. The American police concealed from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police their discovery of Irshad's identity and what her cowardly Muslim terrorist husband Mustafa had done to the American people. The RCMP believed the CIA and transported the Australian Muslim immigrant woman to New York. As soon as her plane arrived at a private airport in New York, the CIA transferred the Muslim terrorist woman Irshad al-Shamari to a military plane and shipped her to the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center for Muslim terrorists. The CIA did not even allow her feet to touch any American soil and desecrate it. Therefore, Irshad Mustafa al-Shamari is the first female Muslim terrorist suspect to be sent to Guantanamo Bay. In essence, Irshad is sent directly to Gitmo and not allowed to set foot on U.S. soil because of her close association with a 9/11 terrorist, suspicions of her involvement or knowledge of terrorist activities, her immigration fraud, and the U.S. government's desire to avoid granting her any legal rights that might be triggered by her physical presence in the United States. Gitmo is used as a legal and security buffer for high-risk detainees like her. When Irshad, Susan Peterson, is detained by American authorities and sent to Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, she faces several serious charges. According to the novel, these charges are rooted in her association with terrorism, her background, and her actions during her years in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Here are the main charges and suspicions held against her. 1. Association with terrorist organizations. Living among terrorists, Irshad is accused of having lived for years among Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan, specifically in the Mujahideen camps in Kandahar. The authorities believe that living in these camps for such a long time makes it unlikely that she was unaware of their activities or intentions. Marriage to a 9/11 terrorist, her late husband, Mustafa, is identified as one of the 19 terrorists who carried out the September 11, 2001 attacks in America. This connection alone makes her a person of high interest to American intelligence agencies. 2. Knowledge of terrorist plots. Suspicion of prior knowledge. The CIA and other authorities suspect that Ershad may have had prior knowledge of her husband's involvement in the 9/11 attacks and the broader anti-Western activities of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. They believe she may have kept quiet about these plans. 3. Immigration fraud. False identity and claims. Ershad is accused of entering Canada under a false name, Iman Atta, and falsely claiming to be an American citizen. The authorities believe this deception facilitated her entry into Canada and possibly helped her evade detection as a person of interest. 4. Material support or complicity. Potential complicity. Although there is no direct evidence that she participated in terrorist acts, the authorities are concerned that her long-term presence in terrorist camps and her marriage to a known terrorist could mean she provided material support, aid, or at least tacit approval to terrorist activities. How she responds to the charges. Cooperation. Ershad decides to cooperate fully with her interrogators, admitting to most charges except for having prior knowledge of the 9/11 plot or willingly supporting terrorist activities. She explains that she was held in the camps against her will and that her husband's instructions and the local leaders prevented her from leaving with her children. Victim, not perpetrator. She insists that she was a victim of circumstance, forced to remain in Afghanistan for the sake of her children and unable to escape due to legal, cultural, and physical barriers. Summary table. Charges against Ershad and Gitmo. Charge/suspicion. Details. Association with terrorists. Lived in Taliban/Al-Qaeda camps, married to 9/11 terrorist. Knowledge of terrorist plots. Suspected of knowing about 9/11 and other anti-Western activities. Immigration fraud. Entered Canada under false identity, claimed to be American. Material support/complicity. Suspected of aiding or supporting terrorist activities, even if only by association. In summary, the American authorities hold Ershad on charges of association with terrorism, suspicion of prior knowledge of terrorist plots, especially 9/11, immigration fraud, and possible material support or complicity with terrorist organizations. Her case is complicated by her personal history, her claims of being a victim, and her willingness to cooperate with investigators. The cowardly terrorist attacks on America on September 11, 2001, commonly known as 9/11, were a series of coordinated suicide attacks carried out by 19 terrorists associated with the extremist group Al-Qaeda. Attack overview. On September 11, 2001, 4 commercial airplanes were hijacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists. 2 planes were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, causing both towers to collapse. A 3rd plane crashed into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The 4th plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was headed for another target in Washington, D.C., but crashed in a field in Pennsylvania after passengers attempted to retake control from the hijackers. Victim, not perpetrator. She insists that she was a victim of circumstance, forced to remain in Afghanistan for the sake of her children and unable to escape due to legal, cultural, and physical barriers. Casualties. The attacks resulted in the deaths of approximately 3,000 innocent people, including civilians, first responders, and passengers from more than 90 countries. Perpetrators. The terrorists were members of Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. The attackers included individuals from Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries. In the context of the novel, Mustafa al-Shamari, the husband of the protagonist, is depicted as one of the 19 hijackers who participated in the attacks. Motivation. The attacks were motivated by extremist ideology, with the perpetrators believing they were carrying out a religious duty to wage jihad against the United States and its allies. The novel describes how the attackers were indoctrinated with the belief that killing infidels was a religious obligation and that dying in such an attack would guarantee them rewards in the afterlife. Aftermath: the 9/11 attacks had a profound impact on the world, leading to the US-led War on Terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, and significant changes in global security policies. The attacks are widely condemned as acts of cowardice and mass murder. In summary, the September 11, 2001 attacks were a series of cowardly, coordinated suicide missions by al-Qaeda terrorists, resulting in the deaths of thousands of innocent people and changing the course of world history. The attacks are remembered as one of the darkest days in modern times, symbolizing the devastating consequences of religious extremism and terrorism. The Muslim terrorists of al-Qaeda plotted the September 11 attacks through a long-term, highly organized, and ideologically motivated plan. 1. Ideological indoctrination and recruitment. The leaders of al-Qaeda, including Osama bin Laden, indoctrinated young Muslim men with extremist interpretations of the Quran and Hadiths, convincing them that jihad, holy war, against the infidels non-Muslims, especially Americans and their allies, was a religious duty. The attackers were taught that dying in jihad would guarantee them paradise and eternal rewards, including the promise of 72 virgins. 2. Training and preparation. The plotters were recruited from various countries, especially Saudi Arabia, and brought to Afghanistan and Pakistan, where they received military and ideological training in mujahideen camps. In these camps, they learned how to use weapons, make bombs, and carry out suicide missions. They were also trained in obedience to their emir, commander, and conditioned to see martyrdom as the highest honor. 3. Infiltration and logistics. Selected operatives were sent to Western countries, particularly the United States, under false identities or with student visas. Some, like Mustafa, the protagonist's husband in the novel, were sent to America to learn how to fly airplanes under the guise of being students or business people. 4. Coordination and execution. The attacks were meticulously planned, with the hijackers divided into teams, each assigned to a specific flight. On September 11, 2001, the teams hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. 2 were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon, and the 4th, United 93, crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers resisted. 5. Religious justification. The plotters justified their actions by citing Quranic verses and hadiths that, in their interpretation, commanded Muslims to fight and kill non-believers, especially those seen as enemies of Islam. The novel quotes several such verses and hadiths, showing how the attackers believed they were fulfilling a divine command and would be rewarded in the afterlife. In summary, the al-Qaeda terrorists plotted the September 11 attacks through a combination of ideological indoctrination, military training, logistical planning, and religious justification. They were motivated by a belief in jihad as a religious duty and were trained to carry out suicide missions against the United States as part of a broader campaign to wage war on the infidels and promote their extremist vision of Islam. Some people consider the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, as the beginning of the downfall of Islam for several reasons, as discussed in the novel and reflected in broader discourse. 1. Global backlash and stigma. The 9/11 attacks were carried out by terrorists who claimed to act in the name of Islam, leading to a global backlash against Muslims and Islamic societies. Many non-Muslims began to associate Islam with violence, extremism, and terrorism, resulting in increased suspicion, discrimination, and negative stereotypes about the religion worldwide. 2. Crisis of image and identity. The attacks shattered the image of Islam as a peaceful religion in the eyes of many around the world. Even within Muslim communities, there was a crisis of identity, as people struggled to reconcile their faith with the actions of extremists who justified violence using religious texts. 3. Internal critique and disillusionment. The novel describes how some Muslims, especially those living in the West or exposed to the aftermath of 9/11, began to question the teachings and interpretations of their religion. The brutality and scale of the attacks and the use of religious justification for mass murder led some to doubt or leave Islam, seeing the events as evidence of deep problems within the faith. 4. Increased scrutiny and reform movements. After September 11th, there was increased scrutiny of Islamic texts, teachings, and practices, both by outsiders and reform-minded Muslims. Calls for reform, reinterpretation, and distancing from extremist ideologies grew louder, as many felt the need to address the root causes of radicalization and violence. 5. Perception of decline. Some commentators and critics, both Muslim and non-Muslim, saw the attacks as a turning point that exposed the vulnerabilities and failures of the Islamic world, politically, socially, and morally. The subsequent wars, instability, and continued acts of terrorism by groups claiming Islamic legitimacy reinforced the perception that Islam was in crisis or decline on the world stage. In summary, the 9/11 attacks are seen by some as the beginning of the downfall of Islam because they triggered a global backlash, damaged the religion's image, led to internal crises of faith, and intensified calls for reform. The association of such a horrific act with Islamic justification caused many to question the direction and future of the faith, both within and outside Muslim communities. Some people believe that the 9/11 attacks exposed the violent and extremist teachings within the main texts of Islam, the Quran and Hadiths, to the world, leading to increased scrutiny, criticism, and backlash against Muslim communities globally. The attacks are seen as a turning point that damaged the image of Islam, associating it with terrorism in the eyes of many, and sparking debates about reform, integration, and the future of the religion in the modern world. Why do some Muslims consider the terrorist attacks of 9/11 led many non-Muslims to read the Quran, and some of them accepted Islam? Some Muslims argue that after September 11th, there was a surge of curiosity about Islam and the Quran among non-Muslims, especially in the West. Many people sought to understand the religion beyond the headlines, leading to increased sales of the Quran and Islamic literature. According to this perspective, some non-Muslims, after reading the Quran and learning about Islam, found spiritual meaning and converted, seeing the religion as peaceful and misunderstood, contrary to the actions of Muslim extremists. Muhammad Noor and his wife, Nadia Noor, are two characters introduced in the later chapters of the novel. Here's a summary of who they are and why they become Muslims after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 on America. Who are Muhammad Noor and Nadia Noor? Muhammad Noor is a French man, originally named John, who converts to Islam and takes the name Muhammad Noor al-Fransawi. Nadia Noor is his American wife, originally named Mary, who also converts to Islam and becomes Nadia Noor al-Amarikia. They are a Western couple, French and American, who, after converting to Islam, travel from Paris to Islamabad, Pakistan, to immerse themselves in Islamic religious education. They enroll in a prestigious madrasa, Islamic religious school, in Pakistan, where they study the Quran, Hadiths, and Islamic Sharia law. This madrasa is described as a center for producing future jihadists and suicide bombers, with a curriculum focused on memorizing scripture, learning about jihad, and emulating the Prophet Muhammad's life. Why do they become Muslims? Motivation for conversion. Both Muhammad Noor and Nadia are depicted as being drawn to Islam through their interactions with the Muslim community in Paris. They are told that Islam is the only religion that truly honors women, promotes equality, and discourages racial discrimination. They are also told that Islam is a religion of peace and brotherhood, and that it offers a sense of belonging and spiritual fulfillment. These positive portrayals convince them to convert. Search for meaning. Their conversion is also motivated by a desire for deeper meaning and purpose in life. They are fascinated by the spiritual and communal aspects of Islam as presented to them in the West. Disillusionment after conversion. However, after moving to Pakistan and experiencing real Islam as practiced in the madrasa and among the mujahideen, both Muhammad Noor and Nadia become disillusioned. They discover that the reality of life in the Islamic world is very different from what they were told in Paris. Nadia, in particular, is shocked by the misogynistic practices, polygamy, and violence she witnesses. She finds herself trapped in a world of extremism, unable to escape, and ultimately regrets her conversion. Key points from the novel. Muhammad Noor quickly rises in the ranks of the Mujahideen, becoming a leader and trainer of jihadists. Nadia Noor, after experiencing abuse and witnessing the realities of life under extremist Islam, wishes to escape and return to Christianity, eventually reconverting and seeking to help others do the same. In summary, Muhammad Noor and Nadia Noor are Western converts to Islam who are initially attracted by the idealized version of the faith presented to them in Europe. Their journey to Pakistan and immersion in a radical Islamic environment leads to disillusionment, especially for Nadia, who ultimately seeks to return to her original faith and expose the realities she experienced. A madrasa is an Islamic religious school. In the context of the novel, the madrasa is described as a prestigious Islamic school in Pakistan where students, both local and foreign converts like Muhammad Noor and Nadia Noor, are immersed in religious education. Key features of the madrasa in the novel. Curriculum. The madrasa focuses on memorizing the Quran, learning the hadiths, sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, and studying Islamic law, Sharia. Students are also taught about the obligation of jihad, holy war, and the history of early Islamic conquests or invasions. Purpose. The school is depicted as a center for producing future jihadists and suicide bombers. Its curriculum is designed to indoctrinate students with a strict, literal interpretation of Islam, emphasizing obedience, religious duty, and the rewards of martyrdom. Daily life. Students spend long hours each day reciting scripture, learning about jihad, and being trained to emulate the Prophet Muhammad's life. The environment is highly disciplined, and corporal punishment is used to enforce memorization and obedience. Reputation. The madrasa is compared to elite Western universities, like Harvard or Oxford, in terms of its reputation among jihadist circles, but its focus is entirely on religious indoctrination and preparation for militant activities. Role in the plot. Muhammad Noor and Nadia Noor, after converting to Islam in France, traveled to Pakistan to join this madrasa, seeking to experience true Islam. They are initially unaware of its extremist nature and only later realize the reality of its teachings and the dangers it poses. In summary, a madrasa is an Islamic religious school, and in the context of the novel, it is portrayed as a place of intense religious indoctrination, memorization of scripture, and preparation for jihadist activities, especially for those who are drawn to radical interpretations of Islam. Curriculum of the so-called prestigious madrasa in Pakistan. According to the novel, the curriculum at this prestigious madrasa includes memorization of the Quran. Students are required to memorize all 114 chapters, surahs, of the Quran by heart. Understanding the meaning is not emphasized. Rote memorization is the focus. Hadith studies. Students must memorize the sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, hadiths. Failure to memorize results in severe punishment, such as flogging. Sharia law. Instruction in Islamic law, including the rules and obligations for Muslims, is central. This includes teachings on jihad, holy war, the role of women, and the obligations of Muslims in society. History of Islamic conquests. Students are taught about the early Islamic invasions, military leaders, and the spread of Islam by the sword. These stories are presented as heroic and are meant to inspire emulation. Jihad and martyrdom. The curriculum places a strong emphasis on the obligation of jihad against non-Muslims, infidels, and the rewards of martyrdom, including the promise of 72 virgins in paradise for those who die in jihad. Basic secular subjects. There is some instruction in basic arithmetic, finger counting, and languages, Arabic, Urdu, Afghani, but these are secondary to religious studies. Military training preparation. After completing their religious studies, students are sent to Mujahideen camps for military training, where they learn bomb making, suicide tactics, and other forms of combat. Gender roles. Boys are trained for jihad, while girls are taught domestic duties and are prepared for early marriage. Girls are not given the same educational opportunities and are often subjected to strict gender segregation and control. Discipline and punishment. The environment is described as harsh and punitive, with physical punishment for failure to memorize or obey. Key points from the novel. The madrasa is compared to elite Western universities in terms of its reputation for producing committed and radicalized graduates. The main goal is to create students who are ready to participate in jihad and to spread Islam, sometimes through violence and terrorism. The curriculum is designed to indoctrinate students into a strict, literalist, and often true interpretation of Islam, with little room for critical thinking or alternative perspectives. In summary, the curriculum of the prestigious madrasa in Pakistan, as depicted in the novel, is centered on rote memorization of Islamic texts, indoctrination into jihadist ideology, glorification of martyrdom, and preparation for military training with very limited secular education. The environment is highly disciplined, punitive, and focused on producing students who are loyal to the most true interpretations of Islam. What is the reward of the 72 virgins? The ideology taught in the madrasa, Islamic religious school, the reward of the 72 virgins, refers to a promise made in the interpretations of Islamic texts, the Quran and Hadiths, that a Muslim man who dies as a martyr, shaheed, in jihad, holy war, will be rewarded in paradise with 72 virgin girls, huri, for his exclusive pleasure. These virgins are described as eternally pure, beautiful, and created solely for the enjoyment of the martyr. The novel details that these heavenly virgins are said to never menstruate, defecate, or become pregnant, and their bodies are described in highly sexualized terms, with emphasis on their beauty and sexual availability. This promise is used as a powerful motivational tool in the madrasa and jihadist training camps, where boys and young men are indoctrinated to believe that dying in jihad is the highest honor and guarantees this sensual reward in the afterlife. Effects of the reward of the 72 virgins on Muslim male students in the madrasa. 1. Indoctrination and motivation for jihad. The promise of 72 virgins is repeatedly emphasized in the madrasa curriculum. Boys are taught to memorize Quranic verses and hadiths that glorify martyrdom and the rewards of paradise, with the 72 virgins being a central, vivid incentive. This teaching is not just abstract, it is presented as a concrete, guaranteed reward for those who die fighting infidels or in the cause of Islam. The novel describes how students are told that the more pain they endure in this life, the greater their reward in the next, especially if they die as martyrs. 2. Psychological impact. The focus on sexual rewards creates a powerful psychological lure for adolescent boys, especially in environments where sexuality is otherwise strictly controlled or repressed. The novel notes that the idea of the Virgins of Paradise becomes the most exciting topic that every student loves more than anything in life, and that students are eager to die as martyrs to attain this reward. 3. Glorification of death and martyrdom. The promise of the 72 virgins is used to glorify death in jihad. Students are taught that martyrdom is not only honorable but desirable, as it leads to immediate entry into paradise and the fulfillment of all sensual desires. The narrative describes how this belief system leads boys to be in a hurry to die or commit suicide and go to heaven to enjoy those 72 virgins and drink from rivers of wine, milk, and honey. 4. Manipulation and control. The reward is used as a tool of manipulation by madrasa teachers and jihadist leaders. By promising such rewards, they are able to motivate boys to accept harsh discipline, endure suffering, and ultimately volunteer for suicide missions or violent acts. The novel explicitly connects this indoctrination to the willingness of young men to become suicide bombers and to the perpetuation of violence and terrorism. Summary table. Aspect. Description. Promise. 72 virgins in paradise for martyrs, described as eternally pure, beautiful, and sexually available. Teaching method. Memorization of Quran/Hadith, daily emphasis in madrasa, glorification of martyrdom. Psychological effect. Creates powerful motivation for jihad, especially among adolescent boys. Behavioral outcome. Eagerness for martyrdom, willingness to die in suicide missions. Manipulation. Used by leaders to control and motivate students for violence. In summary, the reward of the 72 virgins is a central part of the indoctrination process in the madrasa. It is used to motivate, manipulate, and psychologically condition young Muslim male students to embrace martyrdom and violence, with the promise of ultimate sexual gratification in the afterlife as the most alluring incentive. Here's a detailed summary of how Muhammad Noor rises from a Muslim convert to a terrorist leader in Pakistan and Afghanistan. 1. Conversion and early zeal. Background: Muhammad Noor is originally a Frenchman who converts to Islam, adopting the name Muhammad Noor al-Fransawi. He is married to an American woman, Nadia, who also converts to Islam. Together, they leave their comfortable life in Paris and move to Pakistan, driven by religious zeal and a desire to immerse themselves in true Islam. Religious education. The couple enrolls in a prestigious Islamic madrasa, religious school, in Pakistan. This madrasa is notorious for producing the highest number of suicide bombers and is a training ground for future leaders of jihadist groups. The curriculum focuses on memorizing the Quran, hadiths, and the obligation of jihad, with a heavy emphasis on the rewards of martyrdom and the glories of Islamic conquest. 2. Indoctrination and military training. Ideological indoctrination. Noor and Nadia are indoctrinated with the belief that jihad, holy war, against infidels is a religious duty. The madrasa teaches that Islam must be spread by the sword and that martyrdom brings great rewards in paradise. Noor excels in these studies, internalizing the ideology of violence and religious supremacy. Military training. After graduating from the madrasa, Noor and Nadia are sent to the Swat Valley on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border for military training with Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters. Noor receives instruction in bomb-making, guerrilla tactics, and suicide operations. He is taught to disguise himself, infiltrate enemy lines, and lead others in combat. 3. Rapid rise to leadership. Demonstrated ability. Noor quickly gains the trust of his commanders due to his intelligence, adaptability, and commitment. He is promoted to the rank of Qaid Harbi, military commander or emir, and put in charge of training and leading a group of at least 100 young mujahideen, holy warriors. Operational success. Noor's ability to disguise himself and infiltrate NATO and U.S. military bases in Afghanistan earns him further promotions. He is recognized for his cunning and effectiveness in orchestrating attacks and evading capture. His leadership skills and ideological fervor make him a valuable asset to the terrorist network. 4. Becoming a most wanted terrorist. International notoriety. Noor's activities draw the attention of international intelligence agencies. He is placed on the FBI's most wanted list, with his image posted at airports and border crossings in Pakistan, Afghanistan, France, and the United States. The CIA places a $50 million bounty on his head, making him one of the most sought-after terrorist leaders in the world. Network expansion. Noor's network includes not only local Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters, but also international jihadist cells. He becomes a symbol of the global reach of modern terrorism, connecting operations across continents and inspiring others to join the cause. 5. Personal life and further radicalization. Polygamy and abuse. Noor's personal life mirrors his extremist ideology. He takes multiple wives, including underage girls, and enforces strict religious rules in his household. His first wife, Nadia, becomes disillusioned and seeks to escape, but Noor's power and the surrounding environment make it nearly impossible. Continued violence. Noor continues to mastermind terrorist attacks, sending young recruits on suicide missions and orchestrating assassinations of political leaders. His actions are justified by his interpretation of Islamic texts, and he silences dissent with religious rhetoric. Summary table. Muhammad Noor's rise. Stage. Key events and factors. Conversion. Converts to Islam, moves to Pakistan with wife Nadia. Religious education. Studies at a radical madrasa, indoctrinated in jihadist ideology. Military training. Trains with Taliban/Al-Qaeda, learns bomb-making, guerrilla tactics. Leadership. Promoted to Emir, leads 100-plus fighters, orchestrates attacks. International notoriety. Becomes most wanted, connects global jihadist networks, $50 million bounty. Personal radicalization. Polygamy, abuse, further violence, silences dissent with religious justification. In summary, Muhammad Noor's rise from a Muslim convert to a terrorist leader is marked by a combination of ideological indoctrination, military training, operational success, and ruthless leadership. His journey is a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and the global networks that sustain it. Why Muhammad Noor becomes wanted by the FBI. Muhammad Noor, also referred to as Muhammad Noor al-Fransawi, becomes wanted by the FBI because he rises to a senior leadership position within terrorist organizations, specifically Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Here's a summary of how and why he becomes a top target. Background: Muhammad Noor is a French convert to Islam who, along with his American wife Nadia, travels to Pakistan to study at a prestigious Islamic madrasa. After graduating, he receives military training in the Swat Valley and quickly rises through the ranks due to his intelligence, leadership, and ability to disguise himself and infiltrate Western military bases. Terrorist activities. Noor is promoted to the rank of Emir, commander, and becomes responsible for training and sending hundreds of young mujahideen to carry out terrorist operations in Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan. He is credited with masterminding successful attacks against NATO forces and assassinations of political leaders. His ability to evade capture and his involvement in high-profile attacks make him notorious. International manhunt. Due to his leadership role, Noor is added to the FBI's list of most wanted terrorists. His image is circulated at airports and borders in Pakistan, Afghanistan, France, and the United States. The CIA places a $50 million bounty on his head, and he is considered one of the most dangerous and wanted terrorist leaders in the world. Summary: Muhammad Noor becomes wanted by the FBI because he is a senior leader in Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, orchestrates terrorist attacks, and is responsible for training and sending operatives on missions against Western and Allied targets. His notoriety, operational success, and ability to evade capture make him a top target for international law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Irshad, formerly Susan Peterson, spends 4 years imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay according to the novel. Here is the relevant passage. Meanwhile, the detained female terrorist suspect, Irshad al-Shamari, spent 4 years in Guantanamo Bay without being tried or convicted of any crime. The CIA was unable to find any evidence of her involvement in any of her late Muslim husband's terrorist activities. However, she remained on trial until the new U.S. government headed by Barack Hussein Obama closed the Guantanamo Bay detention camp. Although Irshad al-Shamari was officially released, the U.S. government was unable to find any country willing to accept her into its territory. So, the novel explicitly states that her detention at Gitmo lasted 4 years. Irshad, Susan Peterson, is eventually set free from Guantanamo Bay in the novel For the Sake of My Children due to a combination of factors, as described in the text. Lack of evidence for terrorism. After being detained for 4 years, the CIA and U.S. authorities are unable to find any evidence that Irshad was directly involved in terrorist activities. Although she was married to Mustafa, one of the 9/11 hijackers, and lived among Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters. Her own testimony and the investigation reveal that she was held in those camps against her will and was not a participant in their operations. Change in U.S. policy. Her release is also linked to the closure of the Guantanamo Bay detention camp under the Obama administration, which led to the release or transfer of many detainees for whom there was insufficient evidence to justify continued detention. Although Irshad al-Shamari was officially released, the U.S. government was unable to find any country willing to accept her into its territory. No country willing to accept her. After her release, the U.S. government struggles to find a country willing to accept her due to her background and notoriety. Eventually, Australia, her country of birth, is persuaded to take her back. Finally, the U.S. government persuaded the Australian government to accept her back to her home country. Consequently, the released Ershad was sent back to her country of origin against her wishes. She wanted to return to Canada for the sake of her children, but the Canadian authorities refused her entry. Her own cooperation and honesty. During her detention, Ershad chooses to cooperate fully with her interrogators, telling them everything she knows about the terrorist camps and her lack of agency. This honesty is noted as a factor in her treatment and eventual release. She honestly told her interrogators what she knew about the terrorists she had lived with for 5 years. She did not hide or lie about anything she saw or knew about those barbarians. The investigators were astonished by her openness and honesty. Therefore, they felt that they did not need to interrogate her in a harsh way by waterboarding, as they always used to do with the rest of the terrorist Muslim mujahideen detained with her in the notorious Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. In summary, Ershad is set free from Gitmo because the authorities cannot prove she was a terrorist. She is considered more a victim than a perpetrator, and her release is facilitated by a change in U.S. policy and her own cooperation. However, her release is not the end of her struggles, as she faces further challenges with resettlement, custody of her children, and social stigma. Why was there no country that wanted to accept her? 1. Association with terrorism. Ershad's late husband, Mustafa, was one of the 9/11 hijackers, and she spent years living among Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan. Even though she was not personally involved in terrorist acts, her long association with known terrorists and her presence in jihadist camps make her a person of interest and suspicion to Western governments. She was arrested in Canada due to her immigrating to the country under a fake name Aman Atta and falsely claiming to be an American citizen when she was not. Moreover, her association with terrorists for many years made her vulnerable to arrest and detention for legal accountability. 2. Legal and immigration complications. Ershad entered Canada under a false identity, claiming to be an American citizen named Aman Atta. When her real identity as Susan Peterson, an Australian, is uncovered, she loses her legal right to remain in Canada. The U.S. also refuses to accept her, and Australia is reluctant due to her notoriety and the risk of political backlash. She was handed over to the CIA. She is sent to Guantanamo Bay as a suspected terrorist due to her association with her late husband and her years spent in Afghanistan among the Mujahideen. She is detained, interrogated, and separated from her children. After the FBI uncovers Aman's true identity, she is arrested and handed over to the CIA. She is sent to Guantanamo Bay as a suspected terrorist. After her release, the U.S. government was unable to find any country willing to accept her into its territory. She wants to return to Toronto City because all 6 of her children live there in foster homes, but the Canadian government is not willing to accept her back. Finally, the U.S. government persuaded the Australian government to accept her back to her home country. 3. Political and security concerns. Governments are wary of accepting someone with Ershad's background due to the risk of public outrage, media scrutiny, and potential security threats. Her notoriety as the wife of a 9/11 terrorist and a former detainee at Gitmo makes her a political liability. In America, the public appreciated the work of the CIA and commended the agency for thwarting yet another terrorist plot against the innocents of Canada. In Australia, the citizens of Sydney were shocked to learn that the wife of one of the terrorists who attacked the World Trade Center in New York and killed thousands of innocents was an Australian citizen born and raised in their great cosmopolitan city. In Canada, people were astonished to learn that the white immigrant Muslim woman who had lived and walked among them for over a year in the cosmopolitan city of Toronto was the wife of such a dangerous and notorious terrorist. 4. No country wants the responsibility. Ultimately, Ershad is only accepted back into Australia after the U.S. government pressures the Australian government to take her, and even then, she is placed on a no-fly list and faces significant restrictions. Finally, the US government persuaded the Australian government to accept her back to her home country. Consequently, the released Ershad was sent back to her country of origin against her wishes. Once in Sydney, the Australian police put her name on the no-fly list. She is informed that she has been legally cut off from the rest of the world forever. Summary table. Reason for rejection. Evidence from novel. Association with terrorism. Years in jihadist camps. Marriage to 9/11 hijacker. Legal/immigration complications. False identity. Loss of refugee status. No valid citizenship claim. Political/security concerns. Public/media backlash. Security risk. Notoriety. No country wants responsibility. Only accepted by Australia after US pressure, placed on no-fly list. In summary, Ershad's long association with terrorists, her use of a false identity, and the political and security risks she represents make her a pariah in the eyes of Western governments. No country wants to accept the responsibility or risk, so she is only reluctantly accepted back into Australia, where she faces ongoing restrictions and surveillance. Based on the content of the novel, the FBI, and more broadly, US authorities, convince Australia to allow Ershad, formerly Susan Peterson, to return to her country of origin through a combination of diplomatic pressure and practical necessity. Here's how this process is described and unfolds in the novel. 1. Ershad's legal status and international dilemma. After her release from Guantanamo Bay, Ershad is stateless in practice. She cannot return to Canada, where she entered under a false identity and lost her refugee status, and the US does not want to accept her due to her associations and notoriety. No other country is willing to take her, and she is left in legal limbo. After her release, the US government was unable to find any country willing to accept her into its territory. She wants to return to Toronto City because all 6 of her children live there in foster homes, but the Canadian government is not willing to accept her back. 2. Diplomatic pressure from the US. The novel makes it clear that it is only after the US government intervenes and applies diplomatic pressure that Australia agrees to take Ershad back. The US essentially tells Australia that, as she is an Australian citizen by birth, it is their responsibility to accept her. 3. Australia's reluctant acceptance and restrictions. Australia does not welcome Ershad back enthusiastically. Instead, she is placed on a no-fly list and faces significant restrictions, indicating that her return is not out of goodwill but out of obligation after US insistence. In summary, the FBI and US authorities convince Australia to accept Ershad by making it clear that, as her country of birth, Australia is responsible for her. This is not a voluntary or enthusiastic acceptance, but rather a reluctant one, prompted by diplomatic necessity and the lack of any other options. Australia complies, but immediately imposes restrictions on Ershad's movement and legal status. After Ershad, formerly Susan Peterson, is released from Guantanamo Bay and forced to return to Australia, her life is marked by profound sadness, isolation, and hardship. The novel describes her post-Gitmo existence in Australia as follows. 1. Social isolation and stigma. Susan returns to Sydney as a pariah. She is placed on a no-fly list, effectively cutting her off from the rest of the world. Ershad started her new life in Australia with little money from welfare. This amount hardly meets her needs. She wanted to contact a lawyer and file a case against the Government of Canada for refusing to allow her to claim custody of her 6 children who live with Christian families in Toronto. Unfortunately, she does not have enough money to hire a lawyer to file a case against the government of a country. She asked the Sydney Department of Social Service to provide her with legal aid, but the department refused her request. What a pity! The widow Ershad found all doors of hope closed on her face. She concluded that she lost all her 9 children forever, and without her offspring her life became meaningless, and she failed miserably in her tragic life, which knew nothing but torment, persecution, abuse, rape, and imprisonment. 2. Poverty and lack of support. She is forced to live in a poor neighborhood, relying on minimal welfare support, and is unable to afford legal help to fight for her children. Irshad started her new life in Australia with little money from welfare. This amount hardly meets her needs. She asked the Sydney Department of Social Service to provide her with legal aid, but the department refused her request. What a pity! The widow Irshad found all doors of hope closed on her face. 3. Emotional despair and suicidal thoughts. Irshad is overwhelmed by grief and guilt, feeling she has lost all her children and that her life is meaningless. She concluded that she lost all her 9 children forever, and without her offspring her life became meaningless, and she failed miserably in her tragic life, which knew nothing but torment, persecution, abuse, rape, and imprisonment. Once again, those ugly suicidal thoughts began to torment her mind. But her new faith in the Lord Jesus Christ as a Christian woman born again prevented her from killing herself. She somehow believes that eventually her gracious Lord will work out a miracle and bring these beloved children back to her again. 4. Alienation from community. She faces hostility and threats from the local Muslim community after openly returning to Christianity, and even receives death threats for apostasy. The Muslim community in Sydney became incredibly angry with her, and some described her as an apostate Muslim woman and an impure Christian infidel who deserved to be killed, as the Prophet Muhammad recommended the killing of a Muslim apostate. Therefore, some Muslim terrorists threatened to kill her as an apostate Muslim woman. Susan filed a police complaint against those who threatened her life. Sydney police took these threats seriously and arrested some Muslim immigrants and put them behind bars where they belong. 5. Loss of identity and family. Irshad is estranged from her children, who are adopted by Christian families in Canada, and feels disconnected from her own past and identity. She concluded that she lost all her 9 children forever, and without her offspring her life became meaningless. She has not had contact with her Christian parents for over 17 years. She knows that her father and mother threatened to disown her if she marries her Arab Muslim friend, the immigrant Mustafa, and abandons Christianity and converts to Islam. But she disobeyed them. Their anger intensified when she converted to Islam and changed her name from Susan to Irshad. Summary table. Irshad's sad conditions in Australia. Aspect. Description. Social isolation. No-fly list, cut off from the world, pariah status. Poverty. Reliant on minimal welfare, unable to afford legal help. Emotional despair. Overwhelmed by loss, suicidal thoughts, sense of failure. Community hostility. Threats from Muslim community, police involvement. Family estrangement. Children lost to adoption, estranged from parents and past identity. In summary, Irshad's return to Australia after Gitmo is marked by poverty, isolation, emotional devastation, and a sense of hopelessness. She is cut off from her children, faces hostility from her former community, and is left to rebuild her life with little support, haunted by the traumas of her past. Here's a summary of why Irshad decides to go to her parents' residence and beg them to forgive her, based on the novel's content. Context and emotional state. After Irshad, formerly Susan Peterson, is released from Guantanamo Bay and sent back to Australia, she finds herself in a state of deep despair and isolation. She is poor, living in a poor Muslim locality in Sydney, cut off from her children, who are in Canada, and burdened by the trauma and regret of her past choices. She feels that she has lost everything: her children, her reputation, her sense of belonging, and her faith community. She is tormented by suicidal thoughts, but is held back by her new Christian faith. The turning point. One night, Irshad has a vivid dream in which she sees her parents standing by her bed, reaching out to her. This dream stirs powerful emotions and memories of her family's love and the pain she caused them by abandoning her Christian upbringing, converting to Islam, and marrying the Muslim immigrant Mustafa against their wishes. The dream acts as a catalyst, awakening her longing for forgiveness and reconciliation. Her motivation. Irshad realizes that her parents are the last people on earth she would expect to forgive her, given the pain she caused them. Yet, the dream gives her hope that they might still love her and be willing to welcome her back. She remembers the parable of the prodigal son from the Bible and wonders if her parents will receive her as the father in the story received his lost son. This biblical reference underscores her desire for redemption and a fresh start. The decision. Moved by the dream and her desperate circumstances, Ershad decides to go to her parents' house and beg for their forgiveness. She is motivated by a combination of guilt, longing for acceptance, and the hope of rebuilding her life with the support of her family. She spends the night praying and crying, then gathers her courage and travels across Sydney to her parents' home, dressed in her Islamic clothing, unsure of how she will be received. Direct quote. One night while she was asleep, she saw her father and mother standing in front of her bed and extending their arms towards her. Ershad woke up in the middle of the night and started crying bitterly. Her parents were the last people on earth who she thought would be willing to forgive her and stand with her through a tough time like this. However, Ershad decides that regardless of her parents' reaction when they see her standing in front of their door, she will go and tell them I am sorry and ask for their forgiveness. She remembered the parable of the prodigal son narrated by the Lord Jesus in the glorious gospel. Will her parents receive her as a father who welcomed the return of his miserable and penitent prodigal son, or will they consider her dead and gone and kick her out of their home? Summary. Ershad's decision to go to her parents and beg for forgiveness is driven by her profound sense of loss, guilt, and longing for reconciliation after years of estrangement and suffering. The dream of her parents, her Christian faith, and the biblical story of the prodigal son all inspire her to seek forgiveness and a new beginning with her family. Here is a detailed description of the prodigal daughter seen from the novel For the Sake of My Children, focusing on Ershad's, Susan's, emotional return to her parents after her release from Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo. Scene description. The prodigal daughter returns. After years of trauma, imprisonment, and separation, Ershad, formerly Susan Peterson, returns to her parents' home in Sydney, Australia. The scene is written with strong emotional and symbolic resonance, echoing the biblical parable of the prodigal son. Arrival at the family home. Susan, now impoverished and emotionally battered, stands in front of her parents' house, which looked like a huge palace. She hesitates before ringing the bell, feeling like a beggar and unsure if her parents will forgive her after so many years of estrangement and her conversion to Islam. First encounter. The door is answered by her eldest son, the child she had with her Chinese boyfriend, and now he is a teenager, raised by her parents. He does not recognize her as she is veiled, and they have been separated since his birth. Susan asks to see Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, refusing to enter the house until her parents come to her. Recognition and reunion. Her father, Mr. Frank Peterson, immediately recognizes his daughter. He does not wait for her to introduce herself, but runs to her and hugs her. Susan, overwhelmed, begins to cry and ask for forgiveness. Her mother, Mrs. Mary Peterson, rushes in and also embraces her daughter, both of them crying together. The son, realizing who she is, stands in amazement as his grandparents welcome their long-lost daughter, who is found today. Emotional release. Susan collapses into her parents' arms, weeping and begging for forgiveness. The narrative emphasizes her sense of unworthiness and the unconditional love of her parents, who did not allow their prodigal daughter to return to her poor neighborhood filled with battered Muslim women and bearded terrorists. Instead, they insist she stay with them, listening late into the night as she recounts her bitter experiences and her miserable life full of persecution, abuse, violence, rape, and prisons. Symbolic meaning. The scene is explicitly compared to the biblical parable. She remembered the parable of the prodigal son narrated by the Lord Jesus in the glorious gospel. Will her parents receive her as a father who welcomed the return of his miserable and penitent prodigal son, or will they consider her dead and gone and kick her out of their home? Resolution. Her parents are overjoyed to have her back, especially when they learn she has returned to Christianity. Susan feels restored as their favorite daughter, and the family is reunited, with her parents promising to support her as she rebuilds her life. Direct quotes from the scene. Irshad closed her eyes because she was afraid to look at her father's face. However, Mr. Peterson immediately recognized his daughter. He did not wait for her to introduce herself, but ran to her and hugged her. When she felt her father's loving hands surround her cloaked body, the prodigal daughter could not control her emotions. She began to cry and ask for forgiveness. The crying of the rebellious daughter made her mother, Mrs. Mary Peterson, rush into the living room. Likewise, the mother recognized her lost and found daughter. She also ran and hugged her daughter from behind and started crying with her. Her son was the last to recognize her when he heard his grandmother call her my daughter Susan. But he stood still, as if his feet were tied to the ground. Although he knew that the woman, covered from head to toe in degrading Islamic clothing and crying like a little baby, was his biological mother, Susan Peterson, he felt no maternal emotional attachment to her. That evening, the Christian parents did not allow their prodigal daughter to return to her poor neighborhood filled with battered Muslim women and bearded terrorists. They stayed awake until midnight, listening to their prodigal daughter, who died and was miraculously resurrected from death, recounting her bitter experiences and her miserable life full of persecution, abuse, violence, rape, and prisons in that male-dominated Islamic society in Saudi Arabia and in the death camps of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. This scene is a powerful turning point in the novel, symbolizing forgiveness, reconciliation, and the possibility of healing after profound suffering. The novel explicitly compares Irshad's, Susan's, reconciliation with her parents to the biblical story of the prodigal son from the Gospel of Luke for several reasons, both thematic and emotional. 1. Symbolism of forgiveness and unconditional love. The parable of the prodigal son, the Gospel of Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 32, is a story Jesus tells about a wayward child who squanders his inheritance, suffers, and returns home in shame, only to be welcomed with open arms by his father. The father's forgiveness is total and unconditional, symbolizing divine grace and parental love. In the novel, Susan returns to her parents after years of estrangement, suffering, and choices that deeply hurt her family, leaving Christianity, marrying against their wishes, cutting off contact. She is unsure if she will be welcomed or rejected, mirroring the prodigal son's anxiety. Her parents' immediate embrace and forgiveness echo the biblical father's response, highlighting the power of unconditional love and the possibility of redemption. 2. Redemption and restoration. The prodigal son's return is not just about forgiveness, but about restoration. He is brought back into the family, his dignity and identity restored. Similarly, Susan's return is a moment of restoration. She is miraculously resurrected from death in her parents' eyes. Her parents did not allow their prodigal daughter to return to her poor neighborhood filled with battered Muslim women and bearded terrorists, but instead bring her home and support her as she rebuilds her life. 3. Spiritual and emotional rebirth. The parable is often interpreted as a metaphor for spiritual rebirth, returning to God after a period of sin or wandering. In the novel, Susan's journey is both literal and spiritual. She returns not only to her family, but also to her Christian faith, which her parents celebrate. The narrative says, she remembered the parable of the prodigal son narrated by the Lord Jesus in the glorious gospel. Will her parents receive her as a father who welcomed the return of his miserable and penitent prodigal son, or will they consider her dead and gone and kick her out of their home? 4. Contrast with previous rejection and suffering. The comparison also serves to highlight the contrast between the harshness, rejection, and abuse Susan experienced in other parts of her journey, from her husband, in-laws, and society, and the warmth, acceptance, and grace she receives from her parents. It underscores the novel's message that true love and forgiveness can overcome even the deepest wounds. 5. Direct literary reference. The novel uses direct language and imagery from the biblical story to make the parallel unmistakable, inviting readers to interpret Susan's return as a moment of grace, hope, and new beginnings. In summary, The comparison to the prodigal son parable is used to frame Susan's return as a moment of profound forgiveness, restoration, and spiritual renewal, emphasizing the enduring power of parental love and the possibility of redemption after even the most painful estrangement. Here's a summary of how Ershad, formerly Susan Peterson, gets her name removed from the non-flying persons no-fly list after her release from Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, based strictly on the content of the novel. 1. Why Ershad is on the no-fly list. After her release from Gitmo, Ershad is sent back to Australia. The Australian police inform her that her name is on the no-fly list, meaning she is legally barred from leaving the country. This restriction is not due to any specific Australian law, but rather because the CIA, U.S. intelligence, added her name to its blacklist of persons banned from flying. The CIA's decision is based on her previous association with her late husband, a 9/11 terrorist, her years spent in Afghanistan among the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and her immigration to Canada under a false identity. 2. How she gets her name removed. Ershad and her parents begin a campaign to have her name removed from the no-fly list. They correspond with the Sydney Police Department, which in turn communicates with the CIA headquarters in New York. After numerous correspondences and legal efforts, the CIA finally agrees to remove her name, Ershad Al-Shamari, a.k.a. Iman Atta, and her original name Susan Peterson, from the blacklist of persons banned from flying. This allows her to obtain an Australian passport again and travel internationally. Direct quote from the novel. After numerous correspondences between the Sydney Police Department and CIA headquarters in New York, the blacklisted name of Ershad Al-Shamari aka Iman Atta and her original name Susan Peterson were removed from the blacklist of persons banned from flying. Finally, Susan was able to get an Australian passport again. Summary table. And restoration. Step. Action. 1. Ershad is placed on the no-fly list by the CIA after her release from Gitmo. 2. She and her parents campaign to have her name removed. 3. The Sydney Police Department communicates with the CIA. 4. After legal and bureaucratic efforts, the CIA removes her name from the blacklist. 5. Ershad obtains a new Australian passport and can travel again. Muslims in Australia accuse Ershad, formerly Susan Peterson, of becoming an apostate from Islam for several reasons, all of which are described in the novel. 1. Openly leaving Islam and returning to Christianity. After her release from Guantanamo Bay and return to Australia, Ershad officially announces her conversion from Islam back to Christianity. She begins attending church regularly, stops wearing the Islamic burqa, and dresses as she did before becoming a Muslim. This public renunciation of Islam and embrace of Christianity is seen as apostasy by the Muslim community. 2. Public criticism of Islam. Ershad becomes an outspoken critic of Islam, especially regarding its treatment of women. She writes books, gives speeches, and founds an association for abused Muslim women. In her public talks and writings, she explicitly condemns the Quran and hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, calling them the main source of terrorism and the reason behind the abuse and oppression of women. She even demands that these Islamic texts be banned in Western countries. Such actions are considered blasphemous and apostasy by many Muslims. 3. Changing her and her children's religious identity. Ershad not only reverts to Christianity herself, but also converts her children and grandchildren from Islam to Christianity. She changes their names from Islamic to Christian ones, enrolls them in Christian schools, and takes them to church regularly. This is viewed as a direct rejection of Islam and an attempt to erase Islamic identity from her family. 4. Community reaction and threats. Because of her public apostasy and criticism, the Muslim community in Sydney becomes extremely angry with her. Some describe her as an apostate Muslim woman and an impure Christian infidel who deserves to be killed, as the Prophet Muhammad recommended the killing of a Muslim apostate. She even receives threats from Muslim terrorists, and some Muslim leaders issue a fatwa permitting her killing as an apostate. Direct quotes from the novel. The Muslim community in Sydney became incredibly angry with her, and some described her as an apostate Muslim woman and an impure Christian infidel who deserved to be killed, as the Prophet Muhammad recommended the killing of a Muslim apostate. Therefore, some Muslim terrorists threatened to kill her as an apostate Muslim woman. Susan filed a police complaint against those who threatened her life. She officially announced her conversion from Islam to Christianity and began attending church regularly. She also stopped wearing the humiliating Islamic burqa and began to dress as she did before she became a Muslim woman. She converted them all from Islam to Christianity and took them to church on a regular basis. She even enrolled them in a private Christian school and started spending the big bucks on their tuitions and safe transportation on a private bus. Summary: Irshad is accused of apostasy by Muslims in Australia because she publicly leaves Islam, returns to Christianity, criticizes Islamic teachings, converts her children, and becomes an activist against Islamic practices she views as abusive. This leads to anger, threats, and even religious rulings, fatwas, against her from the Muslim community. After Irshad, Susan Peterson returns to Australia from Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo. She faces threats to her life from some members of the Muslim community, who are angered by her public renunciation of Islam and her outspoken criticism of Islamic teachings. Here's how the Australian police respond, according to the novel. 1. Police response to threats. When Irshad receives threats, specifically, after she is described as an apostate and some Muslim terrorists threaten to kill her, the Sydney police take these threats seriously. She files a police complaint against those who threatened her life. 2. Arrests and legal action. The police act on her complaint by arresting several individuals. They are 2 bearded men, 3 veiled women. These individuals are Muslim immigrants who lived in the same building as Irshad lived before she moved back in with her Christian parents. They had learned of her apostasy and her return to Christianity, and some had been following her and spreading news of her conversion within the Muslim community. The police put these individuals behind bars as a preventive measure. Direct quote from the novel. Susan filed a police complaint against those who threatened her life. Sydney police took these threats seriously and arrested some Muslim immigrants and put them behind bars where they belong. They are 2 bearded men and 3 veiled women. They knew about her apostasy from Islam and her return to Christianity because she used to live with them in the same building before moving into the home of her Christian family. Then they saw her when she came to collect her belongings from her old apartment. Muslim women were surprised when they saw her taking off the hijab and the Islamic abaya and wearing a tight sleeveless shirt and jeans that clearly showed her big ass and half of her sexy boobs appearing through the collar of the transparent white shirt. Then some Muslim men followed her and seemed to spy on her. They learned that she had abandoned Islam and returned to Christianity, and she began to go to church every Sunday and wear the clothes of an unbelieving Christian woman. Then they spread the news of her apostasy among the Muslim communities in Sydney, and one of the Muslim leaders issued a fatwa permitting the obligation to kill her as an apostate Muslim woman. But as mentioned above, the Sydney police temporarily saved her from their evil plot and arrested those who vowed to murder her. Summary table and restoration. Step. Police action. 1. Irshad files a complaint about threats to her life. 2. Sydney police investigate and take the threats seriously. 3. Police arrest 2 bearded men and 3 veiled women who threatened her. 4. The arrested individuals are put behind bars as a preventive measure. Here's a detailed look at the aftermath and broader community reaction to Irshad's return to Australia after her release from Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, based on the content of the novel. Aftermath and community reaction in Australia. 1. Social isolation and stigma. Upon her return to Sydney, Irshad, Susan Peterson, finds herself in a deeply sad and isolated condition. She is extremely poor, unable to afford even basic transportation, and must rely on welfare, which barely covers her needs. She feels cut off from the world, with her name on the no-fly list, and is unable to visit her children in Canada or travel anywhere else. She is also emotionally devastated, having lost contact with her children and feeling that her life is meaningless without them. 2. Family dynamics. Irshad's relationship with her family is initially strained. She has not seen her parents for over 17 years, and she fears they will not forgive her for her choices, leaving Christianity, marrying a Muslim, and being associated with terrorism. However, after a dream in which her parents appear to her, she decides to seek their forgiveness. When she finally visits them, her parents welcome her back with open arms, and she is able to rebuild her relationship with them. This reunion is deeply emotional and marks a turning point in her recovery. 3. Broader community reaction. Suspicion and hostility. The broader Australian community, especially the Muslim community, reacts with suspicion and hostility. Some Muslims in Sydney consider her an apostate and an infidel, and she receives threats to her life. The police take these threats seriously and arrest several individuals who threaten her. Media and public perception. The media covers her story, and there is widespread public debate about her past, her association with terrorism, and her campaign against Islamic extremism. She is both supported and vilified in the press, and her speeches and writings become a source of controversy. 4. Legal and bureaucratic struggles. Irshad and her family must fight a lengthy legal battle to have her name removed from the no-fly list. This involves extensive correspondence between the Sydney police and the CIA. Eventually, after much effort, her name is removed, and she is able to obtain a new passport and travel again. 5. Emotional and psychological impact. Irshad suffers from depression, feelings of failure, and suicidal thoughts. She feels that she has lost everything: her children, her reputation, and her sense of purpose. However, her renewed relationship with her parents and her return to Christianity provide her with some comfort and hope for the future. 6. Activism and advocacy. Despite the hostility and threats, Irshad becomes an outspoken advocate for women's rights and a critic of religious extremism. She writes books, gives speeches, and founds an association for abused Muslim women. Her activism brings her both support and further controversy, as she continues to challenge both the Muslim community and broader society to confront issues of abuse and extremism. Direct quotes illustrating the aftermath. She started her new life in Australia with little money from welfare. This amount hardly meets her needs. She wanted to contact a lawyer and file a case against the Government of Canada for refusing to allow her to claim custody of her 6 children who live with Christian families in Toronto. Unfortunately, she does not have enough money to hire a lawyer to file a case against the government of a country. She asked the Sydney Department of Social Service to provide her with legal aid, but the department refused her request. What a pity! The widow Irshad found all doors of hope closed on her face. She concluded that she lost all her 9 children forever, and without her offspring her life became meaningless, and she failed miserably in her tragic life, which knew nothing but torment, persecution, abuse, rape, and imprisonment. She prayed to the Lord and begged him to intervene and work a miracle in her desperate circumstances. One night while she was asleep, she saw her father and mother standing in front of her bed and extending their arms towards her. Irshad woke up in the middle of the night and started crying bitterly. Her parents were the last people on earth who she thought would be willing to forgive her and stand with her through a tough time like this. She had not had contact with them for over 17 years. The Muslim community in Sydney became incredibly angry with her, and some described her as an apostate Muslim woman and an impure Christian infidel who deserved to be killed, as the Prophet Muhammad recommended the killing of a Muslim apostate. Therefore, some Muslim terrorists threatened to kill her as an apostate Muslim woman. Susan filed a police complaint against those who threatened her life. Sydney police took these threats seriously and arrested some Muslim immigrants and put them behind bars where they belong. End of the Nineth video.